Hello, this is Stephen Nojiri, and this is another Tada Genji tradition video. So first let me say Happy New Year, both the Lunar New Year and the Solar. So Happy New Year. This video is going to be kind of short, but I just want to lay out my plans for the new year. So, in this coming year, the plan of course is to continue to provide content regarding samurai and shinobi teachings. But, unlike 23 and 24, I want to spend more time clarifying terms and concepts this year. Basically, there is a lot of unclear concepts or concepts that are misrepresented or just flat out wrong floating around the study of samurai and shinobi. As people say, the samurai community, quote unquote, there's just a lot of wrong information floating around or misrepresentation or unclear ideas. Let's spend this year sort of clarifying and correcting some of that in order to proceed forward in an accurate understanding of the material, both in specifics and in general. For example, I'm going to focus mostly on Buddhist terminology and Buddhist terms and actual terms from the manuals themselves. So, for example, in Buddhist terms and concepts, there is a lot of misunderstanding in both the East and the West. But in the East, it's usually just a lack of attention. It's people that don't understand the concepts because they just don't know them. They haven't paid much attention. They may have heard them, but they've never actually studied them, right? But in the West, of course, there's an overall ignorance, but there is also a high rate of deliberate misinformation or manipulation of information, misrepresentation. We'll get to that later. Furthermore, when it comes to the actual documents themselves, the actual samurai and shinobi manuals themselves, we get it. There's the English translation, but but usually, and all of us translators are guilty of this. There's just not a lot of time and ability to explore the specifics of the terminology, right? And so you get a general English translation, but sometimes there can be, even if the translation is technically correct, it can be overgeneralized or it can be lacking some meaning that is there but just didn't make it into the translation. So as I just said, there will be looking at, I said Buddhist terms and the terms from the text themselves, but in general, just sort of the religious terms. The thing is so what I want the viewer, the audience to get is a more accurate insight into what is actually written in the text, what's actually being taught. In order to have that, you have to know more about the terms that are written out. Not just general English translations. We need to actually dive into those. But more than that, specifically, we need to dive into some of the terms, the religious terms such as anatman and shunyata, and you need more accurate insight. And I say this because terms like anatman are horribly misunderstood in the West, and is mostly due to people not knowing about the Theravadan redactions of the 1100s and not knowing about the amount of French and British over-involvement in the Theravadan reformations of the 1800s. And people have this wrong idea that the Theravadan school represents the oldest form of Buddhism, and that's just not true. It's not true from the Reformation, and it's not true from the redaction of the 1100s. But it's become true. It's a myth that is propagated in the West. And so people have this wrong understanding of anatman, and because of that, they also have a wrong understanding of shunyata. They have a wrong understanding of what is Mahayana. They have a wrong understanding of a lot of these things because they don't know the actual verifiable, demonstrable historical facts of Theravadan redactions and Theravadan reformations. And so there's a lot of false information that a lot of Western people have about Buddhist terminology, that with those false understandings, they don't know how to interpret these terms correctly, and so when they hear them in samurai manuals, they don't really know what's being said because they don't properly understand the terms. So basically, one cannot be expected to truly understand Anatman or Shunyata, of course, unless one is a diligent and serious Buddhist practitioner. I'm talking about a direct perception of those truths, obviously. But what I'm saying is that one can achieve an accurate, what we call a generic mental image, aka a working concept, of these teachings if one correctly understands the history and the actual meaning of the teachings, the commentaries, etc., etc., etc. Or in short, once you have an accurate knowledge of the history and the terms and the teachings, what actually is taught, then you will actually understand the term. Once you actually understand the term, at least on a conceptual level, then when you read documents such as the samurai teachings or any kind of document written about those terms, suddenly it makes more sense. It's not confusing because, for example, to be blunt, you can't use a modern day Theravadan understanding when reading a samurai manual, right? It sound like when you say it like that, it makes so much sense. But I can't tell you the amount of people who try to understand samurai manuals with these inaccurate, completely out of context understanding of concepts. Furthermore, beyond religious concepts that need to be refined and clarified and made accurate so that you can actually know what's being said correctly, beyond those, when we're looking at samurai manuals, to be blunt, there's a lot of context that just cannot be transmitted when one provides the general English translation, right? So the goal of the translation is to convey a general meaning of the passage to the audience. But I'll be honest, there's a lot of subtle and small details that get lost and overlooked in that process. And of course they can become footnotes and such, but let's be honest. Most people overlook footnotes. Most people don't actually read footnotes and stop to really try to consider what the footnote says in the context of the passage. I mean, I'm guilty of not using footnotes, and honestly I don't use them because I know that 90% of the readers don't really read the footnotes and try to integrate the footnotes into their knowledge of what they just read. It just doesn't happen. So this year, 2025, I would like to spend time going through specific terms taken from some of these beloved manuals. Like I want to go through the Kusunoki Kaden, I want to go through the Fukushima Ryu Shinobi Maki, and I want to pick out specific terms and go more in depth to those terms. I want to talk about the actual meaning. I want to talk about associated concepts. I want to talk about historical data that can be associated with the terms. For example, this kanji, the usage of this kanji shows that this document is written between this time period because historically speaking the kanji wasn't used until this time period and wasn't used after this time period type of understandings. Because sometimes when you're reading a document, it is literally like think about even now in the modern day when you hear people talk, you can tell like where they're from or when they're from, based on the terms used. It's just like that. There's a lot of contextual data that's there that just is really hard to explain to the audience when you're trying to just provide the general translation. So now that the general translations have been given in video and in book format, now it's time to go through and look at the individual terms and explain why that term, what it means in a greater context, and why the usage of that specific term can date the document or tell us, more contextual information about the document because that term was used. Things like that. Trust me, when you have this extra information, the overall context is filled in more. You get a much better understanding of what you're looking at. The document no longer is just a generic passage, but it fits into a specific place and time so much better. Okay, so what does that mean? It means 2023 and 2024 were essentially a big data dump, right? Lots of introductions, lots of data being given to you, lots of videos, a book, etc., etc., etc. So lots of data presented. Introductions and data dump, right? Because of that, I would like to spend 2025 more on refining the explanations and refining your insights. So I feel that you, the reader, the listener, the audience, right? You guys, you deserve to know the deeper, more subtle points if you really care. Now, if you don't really care, then you don't deserve it and just go about your business. But if you really care, if you are genuinely interested in this material and you've been following the videos and reading the book and doing your own research, and then this is the time, okay, for you to now refine your insight. Deeper, more subtle points that are actually present there in the documents. Like I said, sometimes a single kanji can contain an entire teaching. But when it's translated as part of a sentence, that complexity and the depth just disappears in the English rendering. There's too much information contained in that sentence to really include in the translation. It's like the sentence means X, Y, Z, but the context of the words used implies a bunch of additional information, and that's just, you can't really put that in the translation because it's not there. It's not what the document says. It's just inferred. So you can't really translate the inferred information, but we can look at that separately now. Now that you've got the basic translations, we can now look at the deeper inferences. Okay? And like I said earlier, I said, even sometimes a single kanji can give very interesting or critical historical data and insight, right? If you don't know the history of a term or the history of a specific kanji, you would just read something in English and maybe completely miss it. Like, in one of the videos, I'm going to talk about one of the terms used in the Fukushima Ryu, where it talks about the shinobi being an independent operative, but there's a lot of subtle context to the term, the kanji used for independent. We just translate it as independent or acting alone or acting independently, but there's a lot of subtle layer there that you need to know, and you go, oh, okay, the reason this kanji was picked is because of these subtle layers of meaning here, which just deepen the passage. You can't include that in the generic translation, but now we can go into the deeper meaning. For example, there's another part where it uses specific kanji, specific terms to refer to specific plant materials. Well, that gives us information about date and time, right? Because during certain time periods, the plants were referred to with these kanji. During different time periods, they were referred to these kanji. So by using this kanji, it actually kind of helps date when the document's written, right? Even though there may not be a date on the document, we can look at the terms used and go, well, the terms match this time, right? That kind of stuff, again, we can't include in the translation, but we can talk about it now that the general translation's been given. Now we can talk about those more finer details. And of course, like I said, like I want to do all this. Of course, I'll bring some new material, but again, rather than just keep throwing a lot of surface level material at you, right? Surface level stuff. I want to, give you new material, of course, but I really want to go through the real depth that are found in a lot of the documents that we've already, again, you've been given the general translation. Now let's get into more deeper meanings. And in regard to new things, right, so alongside the more in-depth look and the correcting of mistaken concepts, which is ultimately all of this, 2025, right, the theme of 2025 is refinement, refining your understanding, refining your insight. So alongside that, my plan is of course I'll continue to address new material, but that new material, I'd like it to be more of a variety of topics that help you understand the greater context. For example, I want to spend a good look at the Suwa deity, or what they call the Suwa shrine phenomenon, or the Suwa shrine continuum, or basically, when you hear the word Suwa shrine or the Suwa deity, what does that mean? So I want to actually spend some time on that. I want to spend some time on specific looks at geographical locations, right? I want to look at specific events, specific, like I said, specific places, specific events, etc., etc., etc. The reason is because, again, now that the generic general English translations have been put out in video and in book form, now it's time to refine your insight. So to have better knowledge of the religious terms, to have better knowledge of the actual meanings and layers of the kanji used, the actual terms, have a better and then have a more in-depth and better understanding of all the contextual data around the author of the text, around the events mentioned in the text, the world that that text came from, more information about that. When you have better definitions, better understanding of concepts, deeper insight to terminology, better insight to the context, than just the meaning of the text, you'll have a more complex understanding of the written material. So, hopefully by combining these, the corrections, the more details of terms, and the contextual data, you can achieve a more accurate and complex understanding. Or in short, using the Fukushima Ryu terminology, you will have refining your insight. So that's the theme for 2025, refining the insight. All right, thank you guys. 2025, Happy New Year. Let's refine our insight, and yeah, here we go.